Starting from the conversation that was had in the first plenary panel this morning about the idea of stress testing systems, do you feel, from where you stand, the work that you've done, that we have enough knowledge to stress test these rural systems? And do you feel that we know, or we're able to give policymakers an indication on what would be the measures that have the highest cost benefit or the most cost effective in trying to mitigate the stress today? And maybe I'll start with Anne, since she was the last one to speak, and then we walk our way back.
So I think this is an important point, and I wanted to come back to it that was made by an earlier panelist. I think this is where we need to go, is to look at stress testing and to look at the trade-offs between the various goals we're trying to achieve with these different farming systems. Sometimes the goal of adaptation to climate change is going to be more important than the goal of yields. Sometimes pest and disease resistance will be more important for certain farmers than yield. Sometimes yield will be more important, but we need to start looking at which kinds of systems can respond to the stresses that farmers are facing and achieve the results they need. And I think the key point I want to make is we need to build the evidence for these systems.
So the answer would be we don't have the evidence today.
We don't have it yet. I think we need
to actually do this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Robert, what do you think?
Well, you know, each time you ask a scientist, do we have enough knowledge, the answer will be no, we need further research. So I guess that we are, as far as I'm concerned, I believe we are more than enough knowledge now to do something. I mean, sort of, there is no good reason to say, oh, we need more knowledge to recommend something. We may not give the ideal recommendation, but fundamentally you are dealing with one of these wicked problems. Each time you propose a solution, you create another problem, and then you have to run that adaptatively. I don't think that there is one single solution. In terms of stress testing, I think that nature is stress testing us already. I mean, so I don't think that we need to run stress testing on the systems. They are already under stress. What we can do is trying to understand better how they react or they don't react under this type of stress. And for that, we don't have a lot of knowledge, because there is something that's probably more important than rainfall is temperature, and we know very little. I mean, sort of take the example in a totally different topic. I mean, one of the trees in the Congo Basin that is a good source of food for gorillas and elephants, nothing to do with humans, but only flowers if there is 1 month below 19 degrees during the year. And unless you have this information for many other things, I mean, you are unlikely to be able to really stress test the system against climate change.
Thank you. Richard.
Yeah, thank you very much. As to whether we have enough knowledge, yes, we do. But because this knowledge not bring to the fore and not being scaled up, so it still looks as if the knowledge is not yet there. And as I presented in my presentation, these small-scale actions that are already happening and building community resilience and adapting to climate change and ensuring food security, they're happening, but they're not being brought to the fore. And what needs to be done is that the capacity of the communities needs to be built, and where it is happening, that needs to be scaled up and extrapolated to other communities. The second is to second-hand, there needs to be policy frameworks and legislative frameworks whereby some of these actions that are happening can actually have a framework in which they can be upscaled both horizontally and vertically, using soft upscaling and also hard upscaling. Third is communication. I don't think communication of some of these actions that are building community resilience is enough. But today in most communities, there are radio stations and cell phones in which, if this is actually being utilized, some of this information and knowledge can be communicated. As to whether the stress testing, we know much about it, I think I second Robert here. We need to understand it better, because with the changing climate, and climate change is a process that is happening and with no definitive endpoint unless something is done to curtail that. Therefore, we need to continuously understand how ecosystems are going to function and how the resilience of food systems will be under this changing climate, under the stress testing.
Thank you so much. Ali, sure.
I agree with previous speakers that there's already very big stress in the system, and what's needed is to relieve that stress. And but we don't have the information or the data now to fully understand how these different stress types and sources operate together, what are the implications, what can be done. So there is still definitely need for data, especially what I was referring during my speech. We need more time series data, panel data to see how these things evolve. And also, but at the same time, there are some policy institutional options about which there is a broad consensus that they may be useful to alleviate a broad range of stresses. For example, those which I mentioned, access to markets or land tenure, secure land tenure. And so these are the options maybe we can work to have a more broader alleviation for the stress.
Thank you, Alex. Alex, since you did run a stress test, I'm not going to ask you whether the stress test is possible, because I assume the answer is yes. But what I would like to ask you is, because I think very much close to what you were presenting, is about the trade-offs between different objectives, and whether the stress test can be devised in a way that can give us useful information of the trade-off between building resilience, achieving sustainable intensification, and so on. And what do you think can be done to improve the understanding of those trade-offs?
Yes. So, first of all, I don't think the work that we have done relies heavily on crop models, precisely because that data on sort of the effects of stress on crops is not there. I think that agronomists haven't thought systematically about this yet. Probably they will. And so we rely heavily on crop models in which you run these experiments, right? And given that, yes, you can start measuring trade-offs across different practices. The biggest problem, I want to sort of stress this point, is that how you define things really matters. It matters in terms of what you determine to be the best practice, and not only how you define, but where you put the emphasis. And sort of, as I said, all these systems deliver differently on different sort of dimensions. It might be food security, it might be resilience, it might be mitigation, and since generally you don't see one of the practices that is superior across all dimensions, then it becomes an issue of how do you choose? Where do you put the emphasis? The weights that you choose will determine the outcome. So I think we have, now we have the information, the capability to start thinking about sort of running the stress tests, getting sort of an idea of the trade-offs. We need to have a field data to validate these results. And then I think as a community, we really need to do sort of to think a little more carefully about these definitions, which to me seems to be one of the major problems.
Okay, thank you very much. That was very helpful. Let's open up to the floor and see what questions you have. Why don't we start the gentleman in the front row?
The actual complexity of actual farming systems. It's truer to what we see on the ground compared to what is assumed in many traditional monocrop agriculture type government programs. But actually I wanted to ask about something else, quite a pressing matter. It impresses me that this discussion of climate change is just bringing together in a kind of meta-narrative. We've talked about these issues before: drought, flood, high temperature, precipitation, excess precipitation, hail, whatever. So I'm wondering what we can do with all of this knowledge for ex-ante action. I'm talking about in 2014, there's a rated 80% chance, at least in my country, affecting my country, tropical country, the Philippines, of a severe El Nino, okay? And it promises to be at least as bad as 2010, where agricultural GDP petered out to 0.5% growth, whereas the rest of the economy grew 7.8%. I mean, the whole economy grew 7.8%. So it might not be a fair question, but from the ideas developed here, what can I draw and take back to my country to, sort of provide some basis for preparation for such impending shock?
Does anyone feel that they're in a position to answer?
You want to collect?
Yeah.
You want to collect a series of questions?
I'm sorry?
Maybe collect a series of questions.
Okay, why don't we collect a few? That's a very good point. We're going to go back there. And yes?
Is it me?
Please.
Thank you. My name is Charlotte Dufour from FAO. I thank you for this very interesting presentations, and I think I take back two messages: is the importance of eco-based and landscape approaches and biodiversity, which are very close to the nutrition agenda we try to promote. And I'm wondering what incentives can be created or strengthened to have these be more mainstream. Because I feel that the major drivers, and especially economic drivers, lead us much more to value chain approaches, monocropping systems, and although ideally these should be complementary, today I believe there's a real tension. So what economic, political incentives can we create to have these approaches become the mainstream?
Okay, so what incentive system can we put in place to apply the adaptation measures? A gentleman.
Up the famous question from this morning, the question to the finance minister, when he has to decide where to put the money in. So, and I think that's the question of the incentive. And from this perspective, perhaps we do not only have to look which crops and which kind of animal production can really help to fight climate change, but also we have to look which product along the value chain is able to respond to consumers' needs, and where is there a chance for products to be sold on the market to have more nutrient-dense, valuable products. And therefore I think perhaps then is a need for a transdisciplinary research in order to favor a kind of selection, which kind of neglected and underutilized crops, which kind of specific agricultural production must be supported in order to meet both requirements, fight climate change and help to produce accessible and affordable food for people. And only if you get this done, I think you have the incentives for the right investment, and I would like to ask you whether you feel there is a chance to go on and who could cooperate with whom. Thank you.
Okay, that was more an observation, but there's also a question. Space for one more question or a brief, please.